The town called Brook Hollow sat in a bowl of soft hills and dried riverbeds where the wind carried the smell of old cedar and warm asphalt. And every day, at exactly noon, a golden-coated dog with a silver grizzle at his muzzle trotted to the cracked stone steps of St. Ignatius Church and barked 3 sharp notes that ricocheted off the bell tower, a ritual so precise that merchants used it to set their watches, and the school crossing guard used it to end her lunch. The dog was named Bracken, 8 years old, a broad-chested, medium-large mixed breed with the gentle eyes of a retriever and the watchful ears of a shepherd, his coat a layered golden wheat with a dark saddle down the spine, his gait rolling and efficient like a farm dog who had always known duty. He wore no collar except a braided leather strap cut short as if ripped long ago, and he tolerated the hands of children, but never let anyone hold him, preferring to circle once, sniff shoes, study faces, and then plant himself facing south as if guarding some boundary that no one else could see. On the second Tuesday of May, heat shimmered in the parking lot, and cicadas rattled in the cottonwoods, and Elena Vale watched Bracken with the narrowed, skeptical focus of a woman who made a living from patterns. At 34, 5'7" with a lithe runner's frame and a stubborn straightness to her posture, she wore a sun-faded denim jacket over a pale linen blouse, black jeans tucked into broken-in brown boots, and an old press badge clipped to a leather tote. Her dark brown hair, cut to her shoulders with ragged bangs she trimmed herself, swept back with a tortoise-shell pin. Her skin was olive with summer, her eyes slate grey with that restless, investigative intelligence that never seemed to turn off. And if you asked people in town about her, they would say, "She's the one who wrote the school board story, the one who got the budget numbers right and didn't scare easy when the power went out during the council hearing." Elena had moved back from the city after her father died of a winter pneumonia that came like a thief. The house on Birch Street still smelled faintly of Old Spice and engine oil, because he had been a mechanic who liked to read Louis L'Amour by the kitchen window, and her grief had hardened into a vow to pay attention to small things, because small things were the threads that pulled the truth into daylight. Now the small thing was a dog who barked at noon, and today his third bark snapped the air and he pivoted, tail level, nose high, trotting across the sun-bleached grass and along the church's south fence toward the weedy strip behind the old feed store, pausing often to look back and make sure the slow humans followed. Elena followed, of course. Curiosity was the habit she could not break. Behind the feed store, where a rusted grain auger leaned like an abandoned telescope and wild fennel grew taller than a child, Bracken threaded the narrow path to the back of the lot, stopped at a concrete utility hatch sunk low and half camouflaged by creeping time, and began to paw, not frantic but insistent, turning his head to fix Elena with those walnut eyes that always seemed to ask, "Do you see it yet?" She crouched, brushing aside thyme flowers to reveal a hairline crack that traced a crooked seam across the hatch and toward the storm drain. A faint, cool draft lifted from the seam like breath through teeth, carrying a smell of wet iron and old stone that didn't match the sun-cooked day. "What do you think, old man?" Elena asked, and Bracken's ears flicked back, then forward, and he barked once, softer, as if to confirm the presence of something hidden rather than to summon help for a crisis. A shadow cut across them, and Sheriff Caleb Haines appeared at the path's mouth with the casual authority of someone who had spent 2 decades talking drunks down from porches and leading lost hikers out of the foothills. 45, clean-shaven with a square jaw and smile lines that didn't soften the vigilant cut of his eyes, he stood an even 6 feet with the solid, work boot posture of a man who lifted hay bales every fall to help his brother. His sandy hair cropped close, his tan uniform pressed but not fussy, a radio mic resting neatly on his shoulder. People said Caleb had been a teenager when the flood of 2004 swept through the low streets, and his older brother had tied a rope to a lamppost and pulled a minivan out of water chest deep, and from that day, Caleb's calm had set like concrete. He spoke to people the way he moved cattle. Steady voice, open palms, no sudden moves, but he could be iron when tested. "You following the church dog again?" he asked, not unkindly, stepping closer, and passing Elena a glance that mixed amusement with a little worry, because he, too, had noticed the noon routine and the town gossip that swelled around it like foam. Elena pointed at the seam and told him about the cool breath and the smell of iron, and Caleb crouched, pressed his palm to the concrete, and frowned. "There's old culverts spiderwebbed under the South Hill," he said, half to himself. "Prohibition tunnels, some folks say. Gentleman named Hollis ran whiskey from the river up to the hotel before my granddad's time, cut himself a maze. But this—" He trailed off as Bracken pivoted again, trotting a few paces, nose to the ground, then halting, tail rigid, gaze trained down the slope toward a stand of chokecherries and a chain-link fence that marked the condemned lot everyone called the quarry. The quarry had once been a limestone pit, and then a dumping ground, and finally a liability stamped with orange signs that said "No trespassing" in letters that faded a little more each summer. And the town had voted, narrowly and with much argument at the Grange Hall, to sell the parcel to a developer named Victor Lang, who promised to build cottages and a studio complex and to keep the limestone bluffs intact for a public trail. Victor was in his early 50s, tall and lean as a crane, with the ironed look of a man who owned many suits but chose to wear hiking vests to seem local. His silver hair combed back from a face that stayed smooth except for the frown groove between his eyebrows, and he shook hands warmly but pulled them away quickly, like touching people cost him. Elena had interviewed him once and watched his eyes flick to her notebook every time she wrote, and she had read the grant paperwork and the environmental impact study and found no smoking gun, only an imbalance of adjectives favoring vibrant and revitalized and sustainable, which meant she needed to keep watching. Now Bracken looked toward the quarry with a posture so focused it felt like speech, and Elena, impatient with the slow pace of adult caution that had let so many small-town mistakes grow fat, slipped under the ragged corner of the fence where teenagers came to smoke and started down the slope, brushing through burrs and broom sedge while Caleb swore softly and followed, because he knew from experience that if he didn't accompany Elena, she would go anyway. In the shadow of the first limestone shelf, where graffiti faded in layers like old music on a reused tape, the ground gave a hollow echo when she tapped it with her boot. She crouched again and found another seam, this one wider, the concrete patched decades ago with aggregate that didn't match, and beside it a rusted wheel half buried in dirt like a ship's capstan left ashore. Bracken set his paw to the wheel and looked at Elena. "Easy," Caleb said, but he didn't stop her when she gripped the spokes and pulled. The wheel didn't move. She braced a foot against the concrete and pulled again, and on the third pull, something inside the earth clanked, not far, a metallic, reluctant unlock, and the seam sighed a thicker breath so cool it lifted the hairs on her arms. "Underground airflow," Elena murmured, "and not just a straight pipe. It's breathing like there's volume, rooms maybe." Caleb stood, scanning the tree line, his right hand resting near his belt, not because he expected trouble, but because long habit had taught him the world treated complacency as an invitation. "We shouldn't be messing with this without public works," he said, but his voice lacked conviction because the dog, with that ancient seriousness of animals that remember a purpose older than language, had gone still, head cocked, listening. From the concrete below rose the faintest sound, a distant tap, irregular and fragile as a spoon against a jar in another room, and Elena and Caleb exchanged a look that erased debate because somewhere down in the old bones of the town, someone or something was communicating. Elena lay flat and pressed her ear to the seam. The stone chilled her skin, and the world narrowed to the tiny mechanical heartbeats of unknown space. Tap, pause, tap, tap, longer. Pause. She didn't know Morse well enough to translate, only enough to know it could be Morse, or it could be the stutter of a loose pipe, or the shift of water. But it had rhythm and human intention, and Bracken's low whine confirmed it. She stood so quickly, she swayed, adrenaline sluicing through her. "There's somebody down there," she said, and Caleb's face changed. Muscles settling into their crisis arrangement, eyes sharpening, jaw locking. and he tapped his radio to call in a code that would bring the volunteer fire chief, a compact woman named Rosa Jimenez, with forearms like braided cable and a half-shaved head under her helmet, and public works foreman Dennis Cole, a big-bellied man who liked to pretend he hated emergencies but secretly relished being the one with the keys. While they waited, Elena used the time to study the ground for clues. The dirt near the wheel was scuffed recently, lighter where the dust had been disturbed, and in the weeds she found a candy wrapper crumpled, its edge torn, sticky with cherry syrup not yet black with ants. A track of shoe prints angled away from the seam toward the fence gap. Small adult or older teen, the tread a cheap diamond pattern like drugstore sneakers. Teen hangout? Caleb guessed. Or someone stashed something down there, Elena said. Victor's surveyors were here last week, Caleb added, and as if the man had been conjured by his own name, Victor Lang appeared at the upper fence line with a clipboard and a smile clipped on like a name tag. "Sheriff Miss Vale," he called, posture relaxed and legs in expensive hiking pants that avoided mud by instinct. "I got a call about trespassers and a dog digging up my property." Bracken's growl was not loud, but it was round and deliberate, a sound that made even Victor's smile hesitate. Elena explained, quickly and without apology, the seam, the cool breath, the tapping. Victor's smile thinned. He peered down as if the earth were a spreadsheet with a misaligned column, and then said, "Of course there are old tunnels. We'll have those mapped and sealed during the first phase. Liability's a nightmare. Sheriff, you understand." Caleb did not answer because Rosa's engine rumbled at the curb and she strode down the slope with 2 volunteers in tow, a portable monitor, and a metal case of tools that clinked like a surgeon's kit. Rosa knelt by the seam, bare forearms settling against the stone. She closed her eyes, a habit from years of reading heat and vibration through touch, and then she nodded once. "Airflow is steady," she said. "There's a hollow. And that sound, if it's Morse, it's faint. Could be dripping. But we check." She tapped her radio for silence and listened again. The tap came, so small now Elena wanted to cry. 2 quick, 1 long. Bracken barked, once, then twice, spaced perfect, and Elena felt a sudden certainty bloom in her chest like a match. The dog had been calling. At noon, not to perform, but to warn, to gather, to teach humans where to look when someone finally answered from beneath. And today, at last, someone had. Rosa sent a volunteer for ground-penetrating radar and another for a pry bar. Victor muttered about permits and insurance, but didn't dare step between the sheriff and a rescue. And Caleb drew a yellow ribbon of caution tape because order calmed crowds and because he knew half the town would be here in 10 minutes once word got out. Elena crouched and touched Bracken's head, feeling the heat of him, the muscle under the golden coat, the steady life of a creature whose patience had outlasted their doubt, and she whispered, "Show us, boy." And when she let go, he trotted 7 paces along the seam to a place where the concrete sounded hollower under a knuckle wrap. And he looked back at Rosa and Elena and Caleb, not like a pet awaiting praise, but like a colleague waiting for the team to catch up. Rosa set the pry bar, braced her boots, and counted to 3. The bar bit, Concrete complained, a seam shuddered wider, and a breath of air rose. Not cold now, but cool and scented with damp limestone and something else underneath. A human smell. Sweat, dust, maybe even the copper of blood so faint Elena couldn't be sure. From below came a sound, unmistakable now. 3 slow taps, then a drag, then 2 fast taps, and Rosa's eyes met Elena's and flared. "There's somebody down there," Rosa said aloud for the record her training required, and maybe also for Victor, who took 1 involuntary step back. Bracken barked again, the sound ringing like noon through the quarry shade, and somewhere far down in the unseen dark, a fragile voice, so thin it might have been breath falling into shape, answered with a hoarse, desperate, "Hey." The word "hey" barely reached them, a dry reed of sound seeping through layers of stone and dust. But it was enough to silence every cicada in Elena's awareness, and fix her whole body on the seam in the ground like a compass needle magnetized to urgency. And Bracken, the faithful golden dog, paced in a tight half-circle as if urging the humans not to hesitate. Rosa Jimenez barked orders in a voice that cut through the haze of shock. She sent one volunteer racing back up the hill to bring down the ground-penetrating radar unit, another to haul a coiled rope ladder, while she herself pressed her ear close again to confirm direction. Elena crouched low, pressing fingertips to the soil, eyes darting to the scuffed tracks nearby. She noticed more than one set of shoe prints, overlapping. At least 2 people had been here before, perhaps more, one tread pattern smaller, another broad with a worn heel. Her reporter's instinct catalogued every detail, and she whispered to herself, "Not an accident. Somebody brought them down here." Sheriff Caleb Haines adjusted the radio on his shoulder, calling in county dispatch with the clipped, economical diction of someone who knew seconds mattered. He requested a medical team, backup deputies, and permission to cut open the condemned concrete if necessary. Caleb's jaw muscle worked as if he were chewing stone. He didn't like unauthorized structures beneath his town. Not after the flood of 2004, not after 3 search and rescue calls in old mines had nearly broken his team. His loyalty was to the living, but his suspicion always leaned toward the hidden sins of Brookhollow's past. Victor Lang, the developer, hovered with his clipboard like a man who wanted to shut the whole scene behind a legal clause. His thin lips trembled at the corners, and Eleanor thought she saw more than irritation there. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. She turned on him with sharp grey eyes and said, "How long have you known tunnels ran under this parcel?" And Victor answered too quickly, "Everyone knows they're useless, unstable, sealed for decades," before realizing his voice was trembling, and he stepped back, dabbing his temple with a folded paper napkin. Bracken trotted to Rosa, sat squarely, and barked once. Rosa exhaled, nodded to Caleb, and when the GPR unit arrived, they rolled it over the seam, its beeping screen sketching bright hollows below, chambers large enough for people, corridors stretching like ribs under the quarry. "There," Rosa said, pointing. "Chamber beneath, maybe 12 feet down. Connection shaft." Here, her gloved finger traced the image. The volunteers set to work with pry bars, crowbars, a portable concrete saw borrowed from Public Works. Sparks spat, dust rose, the air filled with the rasp of metal against stone. Elena, heart-hammering, filmed every detail on her small camera, whispering notes under her breath. She knew this was more than a rescue. It was a story that would rattle Brookhollow awake. As the first slab lifted with a groan, a rush of air burst up, damp, metallic, laced with sweat and mildew, and Bracken leaned over, barking furiously into the darkness until another faint voice answered, "Closer now? Help, please." Rosa dropped to her knees, flashlight beams slicing into the crack. Motes of dust whirled, and in the shaft below, a pale hand reached upward, smeared with grime, trembling with effort. Caleb seized the rope ladder, knotted it fast to a fence post, and in one practiced motion swung it into the shaft. "Hold steady," he commanded, his baritone steady as bedrock. Bracken whined and pawed at the edge, muscles taut, but stayed put when Elena laid a hand on his neck. "We're here," Elena called into the dark. "Don't let go." Minutes stretched. Then, with a scraping sound, a figure emerged up the ladder. A young man, late teens or early 20s, face streaked with dust, hair matted black against his forehead, lips cracked, eyes wild with exhaustion. He collapsed onto the ground, coughing. Elena quickly sketched his image into memory. Lean build, no taller than 5'10", clothes threadbare jeans and a stained hoodie with the logo of a long-defunct roller rink. Shoes the cheap diamond tread she had seen. His face was gaunt, jawline sharp, skin pale under the dirt, but his eyes, a startling green, flickered with defiance even through pain. "Name?" Caleb asked, crouching, but the boy only whispered, "They're still down there," before fainting in Rosa's arms. Rosa's voice cracked. "Multiple victims." A hush spread over the slope. Victor Lang muttered about liability again. But this time, no one listened. Caleb signaled the medics who had just arrived. They carried the boy toward the ambulance while Rosa tested the ladder's strength for another descent. Elena insisted, "I'm going with you." And though Caleb frowned, he didn't forbid her, because he knew the press in her blood was matched by courage, and because Bracken would follow anyway, and Bracken had proven himself guide. Rosa clipped harnesses, Caleb double-checked knots. Elena tied her hair back, her hands trembling only slightly. Bracken nosed forward until Caleb fixed him with a command voice. "Stay topside." Guard the dog settled reluctantly, but kept his gaze glued to the hole, ears high, body rigid. Then Elena descended, following Rosa, into a darkness that smelled of limestone and secrets. Her boots struck a floor of packed dust, and her flashlight caught carvings in the walls. Initials, dates, crude arrows, evidence of generations hiding or playing here. Rosa moved with brisk efficiency, scanning for hazards, while Eleanor swept her beam ahead until it froze on shapes huddled in the chamber's far corner. 3 figures, 2 children, and 1 older woman, eyes wide in the sudden light. The woman was late 40s, short and heavy-set, brown hair streaked with grey, a floral blouse, torn at the sleeve, face bloodied at the temple. She clutched the children, one girl about 10 with dark braids, and a boy no older than 7 with a shock of blonde hair, as though her arms were walls. Their faces bore the pale mask of hours in confinement, lips cracked, but the girl's eyes lit at the sight of rescuers. "We heard the dog," the woman croaked. "He barked every day. We counted. We prayed someone would listen." Elena's throat closed, her heart thrummed. She whispered, "We did," as Rosa knelt to check their injuries. Caleb's voice floated from above, "Status?" And Rosa called back, "3 alive, weak but stable. Extraction required." As ropes were lowered and the children were lifted one by one, Bracken barked rhythmically above, each note echoing reassurance into the chamber. Elena lingered to speak with the woman. "Who did this? How did you end up down here?" The woman's lips trembled. She whispered a name, too faint. Elena almost missed it, then repeated, stronger. "Victor. He said we had to move, that he'd find us a place, that we'd be safe. Then he locked us in." Elena's stomach twisted. Her pen scratched furiously against her notebook. Above, she could hear Victor protesting loudly, too loudly, to anyone who would listen that he'd never seen these people, that he was a victim of trespassers, of vagrants. But the woman's eyes carried a truth more solid than his polished words. Bracken barked again at noon's edge, the sun now pivoting toward its descent, and his voice felt less like a warning now than a herald. Secrets buried had begun to surface. Elena knew Chapter 1 of this story was over, but the next would be more dangerous. For Victor, for the town, for herself. She glanced once more into the depths where shadows stretched beyond the beam, suggesting more tunnels, more chambers, more lives perhaps entombed. Then she began to climb, her notebook burning with names, and her mind set alight with the conviction that Brook Hollow's faithful dog had not finished his duty. The town of Brook Hollow was buzzing by dusk, and the quarry slope became a stage lit by the flashing red bars of ambulances and the bluish strobes of sheriff's cruisers. While Bracken stood sentinel at the perimeter tape, his golden coat glowing in the harsh emergency light as children who had been freed from the underground chamber clung to their rescuers and whispered through cracked lips that the faithful dog had been their clock, their only reminder of the world above, barking each noon like a church bell that told them not to give up. Elena Vale felt the hum of a story vibrating through her bones, stronger than any she had ever written. But she also felt the weight of danger, because the woman had named Victor Lang, the developer whose promises of revitalization hung over the town like banners at a festival. And when Elena scribbled that name into a notebook, she saw Victor's thin mouth tighten as though he could hear the ink itself condemn him. Sheriff Caleb Haines pulled her aside behind the medic's van, his tall frame blotting out the flashing lights for a moment, his eyes serious under the brim of his uniform hat. He spoke in a voice low enough for her alone. "Don't print that name yet. We don't have evidence solid enough. We'll need statements, forensics, chain of custody. If you blow it now, you give him time to bury it." Elena, whose whole life had been built on chasing facts that others tried to smother, clenched her jaw, but she knew Caleb was right. Still, she told him what the woman whispered, and his silence afterward was an iron confirmation that he had already suspected something foul. As night thickened, Rosa Jimenez and her volunteers worked in shifts to widen the opening into the underground system, guided always by Bracken, who barked and paced until he was allowed to peer down each shaft, his nose leading them like a compass to fresh air currents and hollow echoes. With each bark, the volunteers swore they heard something answer. Sometimes faint taps, sometimes just the suggestion of movement deep within stone corridors. By midnight, the GPR scans confirmed there were more chambers extending east toward the river bluff, too extensive to be just Prohibition-era bootlegging tunnels. Some walls were reinforced with brick not local to Brook Hollow, suggesting outside hands had shaped them. Theories spun in hushed voices: a smuggling operation, a Cold War shelter, even whispers of cult gatherings, though no one dared say that aloud within earshot of the children wrapped in blankets. Elena kept her camera rolling, documenting not only the rescue, but the transformation of townspeople as they gathered behind barricades, murmuring about secrets under their feet all these years. She caught sight of faces she knew well: the grocer, the postmistress, old Mr. Jennings, who once swore he had seen ghost lights in the quarry. And every one of them glanced at Bracken with a new reverence, as if he had always been more than just a stray. When the rescued woman, whose name was revealed to be Marjorie Klein, sat upright on a stretcher and drank water greedily, Elena sat beside her, coaxing with gentle questions. Marjorie's face, wide and worn, bore the lines of hard years. Her blouse hung loose over her stocky frame, and her swollen ankles suggested poor circulation worsened by confinement. She told Elena in halting phrases how Victor had approached her family after their house was marked for demolition, promising temporary quarters and then luring them to the quarry under pretense of inspecting safe housing units underground. When they realized they were trapped, he left them with a flashlight and a crate of canned goods that dwindled fast. Her voice broke when she said, "If not for that dog, we thought we'd be bones by now." Elena's pulse hammered at the confirmation, but she also saw Caleb's warning gaze. They needed corroboration, evidence, not just testimony. Yet she knew the truth pulsed here. Bracken barked again, sharply, toward the unopened east shaft, and Rosa's radar confirmed voids large enough for more people. Volunteers redoubled their efforts, chisels and saws shrieking. Victor Lang, meanwhile, paced at the periphery like a wolf trapped by his own den, still muttering about trespassers, insisting his investors would sue, that the town had no right to damage his property. But the townspeople's stares sharpened into spears, and he began to sweat under his expensive hiking vest. Elena caught it all on film: the way his polished facade cracked each time Bracken barked, the way his hands twitched when Marjorie whispered his name again. She suspected strongly that these tunnels were not forgotten relics, but current instruments of exploitation, and Victor's guilt was heavier than limestone. By dawn, another chamber was breached, and the rescuers found not corpses, but more survivors. 2 men in their 20s, disoriented, wrists bruised as if bound before, eyes blinking against the sudden light. They gasped that they had been lured with offers of cash jobs, then locked in when they questioned the work. The evidence mounted like stones on a cairn, undeniable. Elena filmed their rescue too, heart sickened yet ablaze with purpose. Brook Hollow had been harbouring a crime beneath its very soil, and the dog had been the only one honest enough to sound the alarm day after day. As the sun rose high and noon approached again, Bracken returned faithfully to the church steps, sat, and barked 3 times, his ritual undisturbed by chaos. The town heard it differently now, not as quaint routine but as salvation's bell, the call that had brought justice's first rays. Elena stood among the gathered crowd, notebook open, camera slung, tears drying on her cheeks, and she knew this was no longer just a rescue, but the opening salvo of a larger battle. Brook Hollow would have to face what lay hidden, and Victor Lang would fight to keep it buried. But Bracken, unwavering, would bark again at noon tomorrow, and the day after, until every secret underground found light. Noon the following day arrived with heavier clouds pressing low over Brook Hollow, the air thick with a humidity that made shirts cling to backs and tempers run short. Yet Bracken padded to the steps of St. Ignatius Church with his same solemn gait and planted his sturdy frame in the same spot where sun had baked him the day before, raising his head to deliver 3 resonant barks that rolled across the square. And though children still laughed and shopkeepers still paused, now every ear turned not with amusement, but with expectation, for the faithful dog had become the town's herald of truth. Elena Vale was there again, hair pinned back against the restless wind, her denim jacket darker with sweat at the seams, notebook in one hand, and her compact camera in the other. Exhaustion lining her slate-grey eyes from a night of writing draft after draft of a story she could not yet publish. Her instincts screamed to shout Victor Lang's name from the rooftops, but Sheriff Caleb Haines had pressed her with the gravity of his authority to hold until evidence hardened. And so she stood torn between her journalist's fire and her respect for the man who had earned the town's trust through decades of unshaken duty. Bracken's third bark was met with a stir at the edge of the crowd as Caleb strode forward, tall and steady in his tan uniform, his radio clipped at the shoulder, crackling with reports from deputies still scouring the newly breached tunnels. His clean-shaven jaw was set, his pale eyes calculating, and though he had slept less than 3 hours, he moved like a man carved from oak, bearing the weight of the town's safety with quiet endurance. He knelt beside Bracken, laid a calloused hand on the dog's muscled shoulder, and spoke softly, "Where today, old friend?" And as if understanding, Bracken pivoted south again toward the quarry, tail stiff like a flag, and began his measured trot, his nails clicking faintly on the cracked pavement before disappearing into weeds. The crowd murmured and followed, led now not by law or press, but by the animal who had proven more reliable than either. Down the slope, rescue operations were still underway. Rosa Jimenez had stationed her volunteers with cutting tools and respirators, their helmets gleaming under work lights that buzzed even in daylight. The shaft now gaped wide like a wound in the earth, its edges shored with timber, and ropes dangled into its depths where survivors had emerged through the long night. Bracken approached not the main shaft, but a side wall where brambles clung stubbornly, nose pressed to the soil, until he pawed at a patch of loose earth that collapsed slightly under his weight, releasing a sigh of cooler air. Elena crouched beside him, brushing away thorns until her fingers struck rusted metal. A second hatch half buried, smaller than the first, but sealed with newer bolts. "This wasn't Depression era," she murmured, grey eyes sharpening. "This was used. Recently, Caleb tested the bolts, his face hardening. They gleamed faintly with oil, not rust, and the dirt covering them was thin, disturbed." Rosa joined, her muscular forearms flexing as she scraped more earth, and when the hatch edges cleared, she spat a curse. "Someone maintained this. Someone's been using it." Victor Lang's name hung unspoken in the air, his figure looming just beyond the tape line with a lawyer at his side, both wearing strained smiles. But Bracken's low growl vibrated at the sight of him, a growl that silenced even the murmurs of the gathered townsfolk. Elena felt her pulse race. Here was the artery of the story, the junction where secrets bled into light. Caleb barked orders: secure the perimeter, photograph the site, wait for public works. But his eyes, catching Elena's, admitted the urgency. When Rosa forced the hatch bolts loose with her bar, the lid screeched open to reveal not a forgotten culvert, but a stairwell descending sharply, its concrete steps damp and scored with fresh boot marks. The stench rose, sweat, mildew, something chemical, and Bracken barked once, deep and commanding, before bounding halfway down, then halting, waiting for the humans to follow. Flashlights revealed a corridor bricked in with care, not haphazard like the older tunnels, and wires ran along the ceiling, carrying power from a source above. "This isn't history," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with the shock of revelation. "This is a facility." They descended, Caleb in the lead, Rosa behind, Elena close enough to record, and Bracken trotting silent now, only his breathing audible in the tight air. At the bottom, the corridor widened into a chamber where folding cots lined the walls, stained with sweat and dirt, and plastic crates marked with shipping labels served as tables stacked with canned food and bottled water. The scene was lit by a dangling fluorescent lamp that flickered with intermittent hum, and on one cot lay a girl, no older than 16, thin as a reed, skin bruised at the wrists, her dark hair tangled over her face. She stirred weakly at the intrusion, her eyes fluttering open with terror until Bracken padded to her side and licked her hand gently. Recognition softened her expression, and she whispered, "The dog. You heard him?" before sobbing into his fur. Rosa rushed forward with her medkit, Caleb calling up the shaft for medics. But Elena knelt at the girl's other side, voice gentle as she asked who had brought her here. The girl stammered through dry lips. "A man. Silver hair. Promises. He said, work, safe place, then locked us in." Elena's pen carved the name into a notebook, though she did not need to hear it aloud, and she looked toward the shaft where Victor's silhouette still hovered, backlit by daylight, jaw clenched. The chamber revealed more. Maps pinned to walls, recent ones of Brook Hollow's southern district marked with red circles, shipping manifests, stamped with corporate logos that Elena recognized as subsidiaries tied to Lang's development firm. This was not a relic of history, but a staging ground, and the implications stretched beyond Brook Hollow. Caleb's voice thundered with restrained fury as he ordered deputies to secure evidence and warned his men to be ready for a fight if Lang tried to interfere. Bracken, his muzzle pressed against the sobbing girl's hand, lifted his head and barked once more, a bark that echoed through the chamber like a gavel striking wood. Elena felt the narrative of the town change in that instant. The faithful dog was no longer just a rescuer, but the town's uncorrupted witness, his voice ringing at noon and beneath the earth alike, ensuring that secrets could no longer stay buried. As the girl was lifted onto a stretcher, sunlight broke briefly through the clouds above the quarry, shafting into the stairwell to paint Bracken's coat in gold, and Elena's throat tightened with awe. She knew her pen alone could not carry the weight of this truth, but the dog's steady ritual would, day after day, until Brook Hollow reckoned fully with what had been hidden beneath its feet. The arrest of Victor Lang should have been swift, but in Brook Hollow, nothing moved without friction. And by the following morning, the quarry slope had become less a rescue site than a battleground of narratives. With Victor arriving in a polished black SUV flanked by two suited men from his law firm who smelled of expensive cologne and wielded briefcases like shields, insisting the tunnels were historical liabilities maintained only for survey purposes, while Sheriff Caleb Haines stood tall in his tan uniform, jaw locked, eyes narrowed, documents from the crates in hand that showed dates and shipments too recent to dismiss as relics. The crowd that gathered, grocer, postmistress, high school kids who whispered about ghost tunnels, shifted uneasily between the lawyerly speeches and the steady growl of Bracken, who planted himself at the foot of the hatch and refused to yield an inch, golden coat bristling under the noonday sun. Elena Vale arrived exhausted from a night of fevered writing and little sleep, denim jacket streaked with quarry dust, her slate-grey eyes hard with focus. She filmed everything, from Victor's careful smiles to Caleb's terse refusals, knowing the truth now hung in the balance between what could be proven and what the faithful dog had already revealed by instinct. At noon, Bracken barked his 3 sharp notes, the sound splitting the humid air like a ritual summons. And though Victor flinched as if the dog had accused him personally, the townspeople cheered softly, murmuring that it was the bark that had saved children, the bark that had woken them all. Rosa Jimenez strode from the tunnel mouth with her helmet under her arm, sweat streaking her temples, and announced in her iron-strong voice that more chambers extended east and south, containing not only makeshift sleeping quarters but stockpiles of supplies, non-perishables, water drums, even boxes of prescription medications with labels scraped off, suggesting theft or black market trade. She dropped a handful of pill bottles into Caleb's palm, their expiration dates barely a year old, undeniable proof of recent activity. Caleb faced Victor then, his square jaw grim, and declared he was placing him under arrest pending investigation of unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy. Victor's lawyers sputtered about overreach, but the sheriff's deputies closed in, hands firm, and the crowd erupted in a roar that was part anger, part relief. Bracken barked again, a booming note that seemed to seal the moment, and children clapped as if he had delivered the verdict himself. Yet, even as Victor was led to a cruiser, Elena's instincts warned that the story was not finished. The maps on the tunnel walls had shown marks beyond Brook Hollow, and the whispers of the rescued suggested more victims might be hidden elsewhere. That evening, Elena sat on her father's porch, cicadas droning, pen scratching furiously across paper as she crafted not just an article but a manifesto of sorts, exposing how one man's greed had twisted the town's trust and how only the constancy of a dog's bark had broken the silence. She described Bracken in detail, the 8-year-old golden-coated sentinel, loyal yet independent, who had chosen to speak at noon until humans finally listened. And as she wrote, Bracken himself lay curled at her feet, his breathing steady, eyes half closed, yet ears flicking at every sound, as if still on guard. Sheriff Caleb visited near midnight, hat in hand, exhaustion etched deep into his face but gratitude softening his eyes. He admitted to Elena that without her persistence, and without the dog's strange ritual, the town might never have discovered the truth, and he asked her to keep pressing, to follow the threads beyond Brook Hollow, because he suspected Victor was just one figure in a larger web. Elena agreed, her heart thrumming with both dread and purpose, for she knew her pen was sharp, but the path ahead was darker than any tunnel. As dawn broke, Bracken rose, stretched, and trotted once more toward the church, his duty unbroken, and when noon came again, his 3 barks echoed across Brook Hollow like the tolling of freedom's bell, reminding everyone that secrets would never stay buried so long as a faithful dog stood watch. Noon on the 3rd day dawned under skies that threatened rain, the kind of pewter clouds that pressed low enough to make the whole town feel swallowed. But still Bracken rose from his resting place near Elena's porch and padded with solemn certainty to the steps of St. Ignatius Church, his golden coat dulled by shadow, yet his stride unwavering. And as the clock tower struck 12, he lifted his muzzle and gave 3 commanding barks that echoed off brick storefronts and shivered through the gathered crowd, who now came daily not to laugh, but to listen, for they had come to believe those barks were more than habit. They were summons to truth. Sheriff Caleb Haines stood among them, broad shoulders taut beneath his tan uniform, eyes shadowed by nights without sleep, but his jaw set with the resolve of a man who knew his town had crossed a threshold and could not turn back. Rosa Jimenez waited beside him, arms folded over her chest, grease and dust still clinging to her strong frame, her half-shaved head gleaming faintly as she prepared her volunteers for another descent into tunnels that sprawled further than any map had hinted. Elena Vale, hair pinned back but still unruly in the damp air, denim jacket wrinkled and boots scuffed, kept her camera poised and her notebook open, every line of her body humming with urgency. She had already drafted the story that would break across state lines, one that named names, traced paper trails, and told how a dog's ritual barks had saved lives when human systems failed. Bracken barked his 3rd note and turned again toward the quarry. But today, he did not halt at the hatch or the stairwell already breached. Instead, he trotted to the far fence where kudzu and rusted chain link tangled, nosed a weak spot, and slipped through into a patch of overgrown field that sloped toward the river bluff. The people followed, murmurs rippling, until Caleb ordered deputies to hold the perimeter and Rosa led a small team with Elena close behind. Bracken poured at a half-collapsed drainage culvert choked with vines, and when Rosa's men cleared it, they revealed a tunnel mouth reinforced not by old limestone, but by fresh concrete poured within the last 5 years, its surface smooth, its bolts modern. Flashlights pierced the gloom, showing pallets stacked with crates identical to those already found, food, medicine, even weapons sealed in oilcloth. A chill rippled through Elena. This was no forgotten relic. This was infrastructure built for something ongoing. Bracken barked into the dark, and faintly, so faintly Elena thought her mind was playing tricks, an answering tap came back, metallic against stone, the same rhythm they had first heard days ago. Without hesitation, Rosa sent 2 volunteers crawling through while Caleb radioed for backup. Minutes stretched taut until shouts echoed, "Survivors! More survivors!" And then they emerged one by one. A young woman gaunt and limping, an elderly man with a beard matted to his chest, a boy no older than 12 clutching a cracked plastic toy car. Their eyes blinked at daylight, and when asked how long they'd been trapped, the young woman whispered, "Weeks. He said we were safe here until houses were ready." But the door never opened. Caleb's jaw clenched, and Elena's pen tore nearly through her notebook as she scrawled. For this was the proof beyond denial, the final nail in Victor Lang's coffin. Deputies hauled the rescued to waiting medics. The crowd erupted with anger and tears, and Victor himself, already jailed but awaiting bail hearings, became the cursed name on every tongue. Yet Bracken was not finished. He barked once more, low and commanding, and padded further along the bluff until he stood above a fissure where the riverbank had eroded. His ears pricked, his body taut as if to declare, "Deeper still." Elena knelt beside him, laying a hand on his warm flank, and felt both awe and dread. She whispered, "How much more is there, boy?" Knowing he could not answer in words, yet trusting that his ritual was not mere instinct, but duty carved into his very bones. As deputies marked the new site, as Rosa prepared to bring in heavier equipment, Elena turned her camera to capture Bracken framed against the storm-dark river sky, his silhouette noble. And she realized her story was not just about crime or corruption, but about faith, that a town had been reminded by a creature's constancy that truth cannot be buried forever. That evening, as thunder cracked and rain finally fell to cleanse quarry dust from roofs and roads, Elena filed her article to a major paper, her headline sharp and undeniable. "The dog who barks at noon exposed the secrets beneath Brook Hollow." Caleb read it on his porch, the glow of his phone illuminating the deep lines of fatigue and relief, and though he was a man sparing with praise, he murmured, "You did it, Vale," knowing full well it was Bracken who had done it first. Rosa's volunteers celebrated in the firehouse. The rescued slept in borrowed beds, and the town, though shaken, felt knitted together by the shared knowledge that they had faced darkness and answered. At midnight, Elena sat with Bracken under her father's old garage light, rain pattering on tin, and whispered, "You saved them all. You saved us." The dog pressed his broad head against her knee, eyes luminous in the dim, and for the first time she allowed herself to cry, not from grief or rage, but from release. And when the church bell struck noon the next day, and Bracken barked again, the sound was no longer just a warning, but a promise that he would keep watch, that the town would not sleep again through buried truths, and that, so long as he lived, Brook Hollow would remember the faithful dog who barked at noon and led them to salvation in the underground dark.